Waiter saves elderly woman who fainted in the restaurant but humiliatingly is fired by the manager in front of everyone. However, the unexpected happens when a mysterious customer approaches and says something so shocking that it leaves him paralyzed with shock. The refined atmosphere of La Sombre restaurant was as usual elegant, filled with low conversations and the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain plates. The warm, dim lighting gave the place an intimate feel, where the well-dressed clientele felt comfortable in one of the city's most exclusive establishments. Eduardo, a 26-year-old waiter, moved swiftly but discreetly between the tables. It was yet another busy night, and he was accustomed to the frenetic pace of the sophisticated environment. Balancing a tray with steaming dishes, Eduardo tried to maintain the polite smile that was expected of him. But everything changed in an instant. The sudden sound of breaking dishes echoed through the room, silencing the conversations around. All eyes turned to the source of the noise. An elderly woman, her face pale and hands trembling, had collapsed in the middle of the restaurant. A towering seafood platter she had tried to balance was now scattered across the floor, and her fragile body lay among the remnants of the luxurious meal. Without hesitation, Eduardo dropped his tray on the nearest table and ran to the woman. His knees hit the cold floor beside her as the patrons watched the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and disgust. He immediately realized something was terribly wrong. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Eduardo asked, his voice filled with concern as he touched the woman's arm. She tried to respond, but her dry lips produced only a faint broken sound. Her wide eyes were filled with panic as she struggled to breathe. The wheezing coming from her chest was alarming. Eduardo remembered the first aid course he had taken the previous summer. "She's having an asthma attack," he thought quickly. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of calm, was now overtaken by chaos. Nervous murmurs began to circulate, and Eduardo could feel the distrustful and uncomfortable stares of the customers around him. "Breathe with me, ma'am. Slowly inhale through your nose. Exhale through your mouth." He began to guide her, exaggerating his own breathing so she could follow. The woman, who he would later find out was named Antonia, tried to follow his instructions, but the wheezing wouldn't subside. The panic on her face was growing, and Eduardo knew he had to act fast. At that moment, Raul, the manager, appeared with a stern and irritated expression. He didn't seem concerned about the collapsed woman or Eduardo. His priority was something else. "What's going on here?" Raul asked, approaching with a stiff expression. "Why is this woman on the floor?" "She's having an asthma attack." "Mr. Raul, I'm trying to help her, but we need to call an ambulance," Eduardo replied. Raul frowned, glancing at the customers around, clearly more worried about the restaurant's image than Antonia's condition. "Get this woman out of here. Take her to the office out of sight. This is disturbing to other customers." Still on his knees beside the elderly woman, Eduardo looked up at Raul in disbelief. "We can't move her. It could make her condition worse. She needs to stay still until the ambulance arrives." "I don't care. Eduardo, I'm giving you an order." Raul crossed his arms, refusing to budge. Eduardo took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but frustration was building inside him. He knew the manager didn't care about Antonia, only about La Sombra's reputation. But for Eduardo, the woman's life was the most important thing in that moment. The woman coughed weakly, Interrupting the confrontation, Eduardo held her gently, trying to keep her calm. He looked at Raul once again and firmly said, "With all due respect, Mr. Raul, I'm not moving her. She needs help, and I'm going to stay here until she's stable." Raul stood there, his anger growing, but before he could respond, the distant sound of ambulance sirens began to approach. Eduardo felt a brief moment of relief, knowing help was on the way. However, the look in Raul's eyes made it clear that this incident would have consequences. Chaos began to take shape inside La Sombra. The once soft and polite conversations turned into nervous murmurs and uneasy glances. The elegant restaurant, known for its tranquil atmosphere, seemed to crumble under the tension forming round the fallen woman. Eduardo remained kneeling beside Antonia, trying to stay calm as he guided her breathing. However, he felt the atmosphere around him change quickly. The customers looked on with disgust and confusion, as if Antonia's presence was an affront to the restaurant's refined atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," said Francois, the maitre d', his voice attempting to sound firm but trembling with uncertainty. "The situation is being handled." But it was clear that no one believed his words. A woman in an expensive dress stood up from her table, shaking her head in disapproval. "This is unacceptable," she exclaimed, glaring directly at Francois. "This place used to be a haven of class. Now look at what we have here." Other customers began murmuring in agreement, with some rising from their seats, trying to get a better look at the situation in the center of the dining room. The tension was growing, and Eduardo felt control slipping away fast. At that moment, Raul stormed out of his office, pushing the door open forcefully. His face was red, clearly angry, and he strode quickly toward Eduardo and the collapsed elderly woman. "What's going on here?" Raul growled, glaring at the scene before him, his frustration evident. "Why is this woman on the floor?" "She's having an asthma attack." "Mr. Raul, I've already asked for an ambulance to be called," Eduardo replied, continuing to guide Antonia's breathing. Raul didn't seem impressed, glancing around at the customers, some outraged, others simply shocked, and clenched his teeth. What seemed to bother him the most was that this scene was tarnishing the impeccable reputation of La Sombra. "You need to get this woman out of here now, Eduardo," Raul said with a coldness that sent a chill down Eduardo's spine. "This is disturbing our customers. Take her to the back office now." Eduardo looked at Raul in disbelief. He knew that moving Antonia could worsen her condition. She was still struggling to breathe, and he needed to keep her calm until the paramedics arrived. "Mr. Raul, she can't be moved," Eduardo responded firmly. "She needs air and calm. Moving her now could put her life at risk." Raul narrowed his eyes, furious at the disobedience. "I don't care, Eduardo. You're here to serve our customers, not play doctor. Get this woman off the floor or face the consequences." The silence that followed was heavy. The customers watched in anticipation, as if waiting for an even bigger spectacle. Eduardo knew that his choice at that moment would define what happened next. He looked at Antonia, who was breathing shallowly, and made his decision. "With all due respect, Mr. Raul, I'm not moving her. She needs medical help, and that's what I'm going to ensure," Eduardo said, his voice firm even knowing these words might cost him his job. Raul's face grew even redder, a vein throbbing in his temple. He was about to say something when finally, the sound of ambulance sirens filled the restaurant. Eduardo felt immediate relief, but he knew the situation with Raul was far from over. The paramedics rushed in, their medical bags in hand, and Eduardo quickly signaled to them. He explained what had happened, and the professionals began working on Antonia with efficiency. They placed an oxygen mask over her face, and she finally began to breathe more easily. As the paramedics stabilized Antonia, Raul approached Eduardo again, but this time his voice was lower, though no less threatening. "After this is over, you and I are going to have a talk in my office," he said, his voice dripping with anger. "And it won't be a pleasant conversation." Eduardo simply nodded. He knew Raul wouldn't let this incident go unnoticed, but at that moment, all that mattered was that Antonia was out of danger. As the paramedics prepared the stretcher to take Antonia to the hospital, a collective sigh of relief swept through the restaurant. The customers began returning to their tables, though they continued to whisper among themselves, clearly unsettled by what they had witnessed. Raul watched everything closely, his face still stern, but he said nothing more. Eduardo, on the other hand, stayed by the paramedic's side, ensuring that Antonia was well until the very last moment when the ambulance drove off. Eduardo remained standing at the restaurant door, watching the red lights fade into the distance. La Sombra was slowly returning to its routine. The customers, though still uneasy, gradually resumed their seats. Murmurs could still be heard, but the focus had shifted from the fallen woman to the young waiter who dared to defy the manager's order. Eduardo knew what was coming. He took a deep breath and turned to face Raul, who was waiting with a grim expression. "Eduardo, my office now?" Raul called out in a tone that left no room for objections. Eduardo looked around the dining room. Some of his colleagues stared at him with worried expressions, while others avoided eye contact, afraid to get involved in the situation. He gave a brief nod to Maria, the waitress who had always supported him, and slowly walked toward the office. As soon as he entered the small room, decorated with luxurious furniture and books neatly arranged on the shelves, Raul slammed the door shut, making a loud noise that echoed through the space. Eduardo stood his ground, trying to stay calm, but he knew what was coming wouldn't be easy. "Sit down," Raul ordered, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. Eduardo hesitated for a moment but decided to sit, clasping his hands in his lap as he awaited the manager's words. Raul walked around the desk and sat down slowly, his eyes fixed on Eduardo. The anger on Raul's face was contained but clearly visible. "What do you think you're doing, Eduardo?" Raul began, his voice low but exuding irritation. "I gave you a clear order. I told you to get that woman out of the dining room, and you defied me in front of all the customers." Eduardo straightened his back and replied, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Raul, with all due respect, that woman's life was at risk. Moving her could have worsened her condition. I only did what was right." Raul scoffed and slammed his hand on the desk, causing the papers on it to tremble. "What's right?" he retorted, his face growing even redder. "What's right here, Eduardo, is that you jeopardize the reputation of this restaurant. La Sombra is known for its exclusivity, its impeccable atmosphere. We can't allow scenes like that to happen in the middle of our dining room." Eduardo blinked incredulously at the words coming out of the manager's mouth. "Are you saying that a person's life is worth less than the image of this place?" he asked, unable to believe the conversation he was having. Raul shook his head impatiently. don't be naive, Eduardo. Of course, that woman's life matters, but you should have handled the situation differently. You should have called an ambulance discreetly and taken the woman out through the back. He crossed his arms, irritated. Now look where we are. Customers leaving, complaining. You caused the spectacle. Eduardo felt anger boiling inside him, but tried to keep control. With all due respect, sir, she wasn't a spectacle. She was a person in need, and I acted as any decent human being would. Eduardo said, his words filled with conviction. I couldn't have risked her life just to keep the customers comfortable. Raul narrowed his eyes, clearly offended by the response. He leaned forward, crossing his hands on the desk. We're not talking about morality here, Eduardo. We're talking about how you disobeyed a direct order and disrupted the restaurant's operation. His voice grew firmer, each word heavy with disapproval. Because of that, you're fired. Those words hit Eduardo like a stone in his chest. Although he had expected something like this, hearing the sentence still struck him hard. He stayed silent for a few seconds, processing the decision. Memories of all the shifts, the hours of hard work, the plans to use his salary to help his family and continue his studies. All of it flashed through his mind in an instant, but Eduardo didn't let sadness or fear take over. Instead, he stood up slowly, maintaining his composure, and looked Raul in the eye. If that's how it's going to be, Mr. Raul, I accept it, Eduardo said, taking a deep breath. But know this, even fired, I don't regret what I did, and I would do it all again if necessary. Raul seemed surprised by Eduardo's calmness. He had expected anger or submission, but not this firmness. The manager simply shook his head in disapproval. Then gather your things and leave. You're dismissed immediately. Eduardo nodded. He knew this moment would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated the impact it would have on his life. He left Raul's office without looking back, feeling the eyes of his colleagues on him. As he crossed the dining room, Maria, who had been watching from a distance, hurried over to him. Eduardo, she called, her voice soft but filled with concern. Did he fire you? Eduardo forced a smile, trying to stay upbeat despite what had just happened. Yes, Maria, he fired me, but it's okay. I did what I had to do. Maria squeezed his hand tightly. You did the right thing, Eduardo. We all know that. He smiled at her, grateful for the support. But he knew nothing could change the fact that his future in that place was over. Now, he would have to face a new chapter without knowing exactly what lay ahead. Eduardo left Raul's office with the weight of his dismissal hanging over his shoulders. The air in La Sombra restaurant felt heavier than ever, and the silence from his co-workers only amplified the gravity of the moment. Each step he took toward the exit was a mix of frustration and acceptance. He knew what he had done was right, but the reality of losing his job, his source of income, was beginning to sink in. Maria, the waitress who had always supported him, was the first to rush over. Eduardo, she called, almost whispering to avoid drawing Raul's attention, who was still in the office. What did he say? What happened? Eduardo forced a tired smile. He fired me, Maria, and honestly, I already knew this was coming. He shrugged, trying to downplay the weight of the situation. I did what I had to do. Maria's eyes filled with compassion. She grabbed his arm as if trying to offer some comfort, knowing it wouldn't be enough. This is unfair. You were just helping that woman. I can't believe Raul did this to you. Eduardo let out a short, bitter laugh. He cares more about the restaurant's reputation than people, Maria. I already knew that, and yet I chose to do what I thought was right. A few other colleagues approached, whispering words of support, but everyone knew no one could change Raul's decision. Eduardo thanked each one for their kindness, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. La Sombra had been his workplace for years, but now it was time to move on. He headed to the locker room, gathered his few belongings, and with his bag slung over his shoulder, walked through the restaurant one last time. The place that had once felt familiar and even welcoming now seemed cold and distant. As he reached the exit, he looked back one final time. Raul was still in the office, and life inside La Sombra seemed to continue as if nothing had happened. With a deep sigh, Eduardo opened the door and stepped out. The night was cold, and the wind cut through Eduardo's skin as he walked down the street. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the distant sounds of cars and people contrasted with the silence he felt inside. He didn't have a clear plan in mind, but he knew there was no turning back. There was nothing left for him at La Sombra now. As he walked, Eduardo was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of thoughts. His mind returned to the scene at the restaurant when Antonia had collapsed on the floor, and he made the decision to help her, to defy Raul. He wondered if it had all been worth it. Although he knew he had done the right thing, the reality of losing his job was hard to face. But as if fate had been waiting to act, a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Eduardo, wait." Eduardo stopped and looked in the direction of the voice. To his surprise, it was Samuel, the man who had witnessed the entire situation at the restaurant, Antonia's husband. Samuel crossed the street quickly, his face lit with a mixture of concern and determination. "Eduardo, please give me a minute," Samuel said, slightly out of breath. "I need to talk to you." Eduardo paused, surprised but curious. He didn't know what to expect. But Samuel's presence seemed to bring some hope, even though he didn't know why. "Of course, sir," Eduardo replied, trying to hide the exhaustion in his voice. "I saw what happened at the restaurant. How you handled the situation, and honestly, I was impressed," Samuel began, looking Eduardo directly in the eyes. "Few people would have the courage to do what you did, especially knowing it could cost them their job." Eduardo sighed, shaking his head. "I just did what anyone would do, sir. That woman needed help, and I couldn't just ignore her." Samuel smiled, but his expression turned serious. "Many would have ignored her, Eduardo. Many would have followed Raul's orders even knowing it was wrong. But you didn't, and that's why I'm here now." Eduardo frowned, confused. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." Samuel looked at the horizon for a moment, as if organizing his thoughts, before turning back to Eduardo. "My wife and I are not just ordinary customers. We have a project, something that's directly connected to what happened at La Sombra today." He paused, watching Eduardo's reaction. "We work with people who find themselves in difficult situations, people who need help and often have no one to turn to." Eduardo remained silent, absorbing Samuel's words. He hadn't expected this, but something about what Samuel said piqued his curiosity. "What do you mean by that, sir?" Eduardo asked hesitantly. Samuel smiled again, this time with a sparkle in his eyes. "I want you to be part of it, Eduardo. I want you to work with us. We need people like you, with principles and compassion. who don't hesitate to do the right thing even when there are consequences. I know you've just lost your job, but maybe this is a new beginning. Eduardo was speechless for a few seconds, trying to process the unexpected offer. The idea seemed too good to be true, but he could feel the sincerity in Samuel's words. I don't know what to say, sir. This is a bit unexpected, Eduardo admitted, still in shock. I know, Samuel chuckled softly. I'm not asking for an answer right now. Just think about it. Here's my card. We can meet tomorrow if you'd like. Let's talk more about what we do and how you can help. Eduardo took the business card Samuel handed him. He looked at the gold-printed letters, feeling the weight of the decision he would have to make. Thank you, sir. I'll think about it, Eduardo said, still unsure of what to do. Samuel nodded, extending his hand to Eduardo. Take your time, and remember, sometimes doors close to open better ones. Eduardo shook Samuel's hand and watched as he walked back across the street. When he was alone again, Eduardo looked at the card in his hand. For the first time that night, he felt a small spark of hope. He knew his life had changed forever that night, and despite all the fear and uncertainty, maybe this was the opportunity he had always needed. With a sigh, he put the card in his pocket and started walking home, sensing that something bigger was on the horizon. Eduardo spent the night tossing and turning, fiddling with Samuel's business card between his fingers as if it held the key to all his uncertainties. The offer Samuel had made was tempting, almost surreal. It was as if, all of a sudden, fate had decided that he deserved something better, something greater than serving tables at a luxury restaurant. But along with the excitement came fear of the unknown, fear of accepting a responsibility he might not be ready for. As the first light of morning broke through the curtains of his room, Eduardo got up exhausted, but with his mind full of thoughts. He needed time to think, clarity to understand if this was truly the right direction for his life. After a quick coffee, Eduardo decided to walk to the nearby park. The silence of the trees and the distant sounds of birds brought him a sense of calm. Sitting on a bench under the shade of a large fig tree, he finally had a moment to reflect on everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. As he looked out at the horizon, Samuel's words echoed in his mind. We need people like you with principles and compassion. Eduardo had never thought of himself as extraordinary, but the way Samuel described him, as if he was someone capable of changing the world, ignited a flame within him that he couldn't ignore. Yet doubt consumed him. Am I ready for this? He asked himself countless times. His job at La Sombra, though humble, had been his safety net. He knew how to deal with difficult customers, how to survive the exhausting routine, and how to keep his dignity even under the pressure of a manager like Raul. But stepping into a project that seemed so grand and unknown, that was a leap into the unknown. Eduardo thought about his family. They depended on his income, and he couldn't let them down. But at the same time, he knew that continuing as a waiter wouldn't take him any further than where he already was. Maybe Samuel's offer was the chance he needed to grow, to truly make a difference, not just for himself, but for others who, like him, were stuck in difficult circumstances. As he reflected, his phone vibrated in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Samuel. Eduardo, I hope you're doing well. I don't want to rush you, but if you decide to meet, I'm available this afternoon. Let me know if you can come. Eduardo read the message several times, pondering. He knew that if he went to meet Samuel, he would be opening the door to something completely new. The offer was real, and the decision had to be made. He slowly stood up from the bench, took a deep breath, and replied to the message. I'll be there at 2 p.m. Thank you for the opportunity. With the message sent, Eduardo felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He knew he had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. Time seemed to fly as the afternoon approached. Eduardo went back home, got ready as best as he could, and by 1:30 p.m., he was already on the bus heading to the address Samuel had sent him. When he arrived at the modern building where Samuel's office was located, Eduardo felt his heart race. He entered the elegant lobby and was greeted by the receptionist, who led him to the elevator. Everything seemed sophisticated and impressive, so different from his previous routine. On the 12th floor, the elevator doors opened to a spacious room illuminated by large glass windows, offering a panoramic view of the city. Samuel was there, sitting in a leather chair, flipping through some papers. But when he saw Eduardo, he immediately stood up with a welcoming smile. Eduardo, I'm glad you came. Please, have a seat, Samuel said, pointing to a comfortable chair in front of his desk. Eduardo smiled back, still a bit nervous but trying to stay composed. Thank you, sir. I decided to hear more about your proposal, Eduardo said as he settled into the chair. Samuel nodded, satisfied. Of course, I'm glad you came. I'm sure you must be wondering what exactly we do here and why I think you would be an important part of our project. Samuel began, his voice calm and engaging. Eduardo was attentive, eager to finally understand what was behind the offer. My wife Antonia and I run a foundation that works with people in vulnerable situations. These are individuals who, for various reasons, find themselves marginalized by society. Our focus is on reintegrating them, providing support and new opportunities. Most of these people have gone through extreme situations, whether it's poverty, abandonment, or even discrimination, Samuel explained, watching Eduardo's reaction. Eduardo nodded, intrigued. And where do I come in? He asked, trying to understand how he, a simple waiter, could contribute to something so grand. Samuel smiled. You've already proven that you have what we need, Eduardo, he said firmly. At the restaurant, you showed compassion and integrity, even knowing it might cost you your job. That's what we're talking about. We need people who can handle human situations, who can connect genuinely with those who need it most. Eduardo was silent for a moment, absorbing Samuel's words. He had never thought that his actions that night could be seen as something so significant. So, you want me to work directly with these people? Eduardo asked, still a bit hesitant. Exactly, Samuel replied. We want you to be part of our team. Someone who can be a bridge between these people and the opportunities we can offer. Someone who understands the value of compassion and human dignity. Eduardo was silent again, reflecting. It was an incredible offer, but also a huge challenge. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, sir, Eduardo finally admitted, looking at Samuel. I've never done anything like this before. Samuel smiled, understanding. No one is born knowing how to do it, Eduardo, but I believe in your potential. And from what I've seen, you're already on the right path. Think of this as a new phase in your life, something that can not only change your future, but the future of many others. Eduardo felt the weight of responsibility in Samuel's words, but also something he hadn't expected: a sense of purpose. "You don't have to decide now," Samuel continued, "but think it over, and when you're ready, the door will be open." Eduardo nodded, and with a firm handshake, he bid farewell to Samuel. He left the building with his mind racing. Samuel's words echoed in his thoughts: a new phase in your life, something that can change not just your future, but the future of many others. It all seemed too grand, almost surreal. He couldn't stop asking himself, am I really ready for this? As Eduardo walked through the city streets, doubts continued to haunt him. He had always been a simple man, following a predictable routine, dealing with the challenges of daily life without grand ambitions. The job at La Sombra, though exhausting, provided stability, and it was that stability he relied on to support himself and, in part, help his family. But now, he was facing something completely unknown, and this new path came with a huge load of responsibility. Eduardo decided he needed a quiet place to think. He crossed the neighborhood square, where a small cozy cafe caught his attention. He went inside, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window. There, with the warm cup in his hands, he was finally able to organize his thoughts. What am I really looking for, he asked himself. The answer didn't come immediately, but he knew one thing for sure. The job at La Sombra wasn't the end of the road for him. Something inside him longed for more, for a greater purpose. What Samuel had offered seemed like the answer to that. But there was still a void, a fear of the unknown, that prevented him from embracing the opportunity without hesitation. As he sipped his coffee, Eduardo thought about his family. He knew they were proud of him, especially his mother, who had always encouraged him to be someone of integrity and to do the right thing no matter the circumstances. He imagined how she would react to the news that he had been fired. She might be worried, but on the other hand, Eduardo was sure she would support him if he decided to follow the new path Samuel had proposed. Days passed quickly. Eduardo hadn't made a definitive decision yet, but he felt that with each passing hour, his heart was leaning more toward accepting the offer. He began to see that maybe the fear of the unknown was in fact a sign that he was about to grow, to transform. Then one evening, as he sat at his dining table with the phone in hand, Eduardo gathered his courage. He dialed Samuel's number, waiting anxiously as the phone rang. Samuel Correa speaking, answered the familiar voice, as cordial as always. "Hello, Mr. Samuel. This is Eduardo," he began, his tone firm, though his heart was racing. "I've thought a lot about the offer you made, and I've decided to accept. I want to be part of your project." On the other end of the line, Samuel was silent for a second, but soon his voice was filled with enthusiasm. "Eduardo, that's wonderful news. I'm so happy to hear that. I knew you'd make the right decision." Samuel sounded genuinely excited. "We can start discussing how you'll integrate into our team as early as tomorrow." Eduardo smiled, relieved and excited about the future unfolding before him. "Great, I'll be there tomorrow," he replied, feeling for the first time that he had made the right decision. The next morning, Eduardo arrived at Samuel's office with a renewed sense of purpose. When the elevator doors opened on the 12th floor, Samuel greeted him with a wide smile. "Eduardo, welcome officially to the team," Samuel said, shaking his hand firmly. "We have a lot of work ahead, but I believe you'll be a key part of everything we're building." Eduardo was still a bit nervous, but Samuel's warm reception reassured him. He knew that from that moment on, his life was taking a new direction. They entered the meeting room where Antonia, Samuel's wife, was already waiting with several documents spread across the table. "Eduardo, good to see you again," Antonia said with a gentle smile. "Samuel has told me a lot about you. I'm so glad you decided to join us." Eduardo thanked her, feeling welcomed. They spent the morning discussing the details of the project. Samuel and Antonia explained how their foundation worked, offering support to people in vulnerable situations, providing training and social reintegration through partnerships with companies. They helped the homeless, refugees, and even former inmates, giving a second chance to those who had been marginalized by society. Eduardo's role would be to work directly with these people, creating a bridge between them and the opportunities offered by the foundation. His job would involve visiting them, understanding their stories and struggles, and finding practical solutions to change their lives. "You'll be our connection to what's really happening on the streets," Antonia said as she explained more details. "We need someone who isn't afraid to face reality and who can handle the complexities of each case." The responsibility seemed enormous, but Eduardo felt more confident with each word. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew this was his chance to do something meaningful, something that truly mattered. "I'm ready," Eduardo said firmly. "I don't know everything, but I'm willing to learn and do my best." Samuel nodded, pleased. "And that's exactly what we need. Someone with the heart and will to do the right thing. We'll start slowly so you can adapt, but I know that before long, you'll be essential to what we're doing here." The afternoon passed quickly, and Eduardo left the office feeling lighter. He had finally found something that made sense to him. The fear was still there, but now it was overcome by the excitement of being able to make a difference. He didn't know exactly where this new path would lead, but he knew he was ready to face it with courage. Eduardo woke up the next day with a mix of nervousness and excitement. This would be his first official day working at Samuel and Antonia's foundation, and he knew the responsibilities that came with the job wouldn't be easy. Even so, something inside him pushed him forward, determined to make a difference. He dressed simply but professionally and left home earlier than usual. The route to Samuel's office was starting to become familiar, and the modern and welcoming atmosphere of the foundation seemed more inviting with each visit. Upon arrival, he was greeted by Antonia, who was waiting with a stack of neatly organized papers on the meeting room table. "Good morning, Eduardo. Are you ready to get started?" she asked with a gentle smile. "Yes, I'm ready," Antonia replied, trying to hide his nervousness. Antonia laughed, shaking her head. "No need for ma'am. Just call me Antonia. Here, we're all equal, working for a common good." She pulled out a chair and sat next to him, spreading the papers on the table. "Today, I want to show you some of the stories of the people we work with. I know all of this might seem overwhelming at first, but each of these stories has something in common. They show how a life can drastically change with a simple act of support and understanding." Eduardo picked up the first file. It was the story of a woman named Solange who had lost everything after a work accident and, without support or resources, ended up living on the streets. He read about her struggles, her despair, and finally, how the foundation intervened. giving her a second chance at reintegration into society. Solange now works at one of the companies we partner with. It's been a long journey for her, but you can see the impact the right help at the right time can have, Antonia said, watching Eduardo closely. It's incredible, he replied, amazed by how a change in perspective and support could transform a life. And this is just one of many cases you'll be hearing about, Antonia continued. And starting today, you'll be part of this. We'll go slowly, but I want you to start following some of our clients and understanding their needs. They need to feel like they can trust you. Eduardo nodded, feeling the seriousness of the task. Being a bridge between these people and the opportunities offered by the foundation wasn't something he took lightly. He knew that each person carried emotional baggage full of difficulties and scars, and that he needed to be prepared to handle this with empathy and care. Today, you'll come with me to one of the community centers where some of our clients are going through reintegration programs. I want you to meet Diego, Antonia said, gathering the papers. He's one of our recent cases. He has a lot of potential, but he's still dealing with trust issues. It's been hard for him to accept help. Eduardo listened carefully, absorbing every detail. Diego seemed like the kind of person who would need time to trust, and Eduardo knew he'd have to be patient and sensitive. Soon after, they left the office and drove to the community center, located in a less privileged area of the city. The place was simple but well maintained, and as they arrived, Eduardo felt the impact that environment had on the lives of the people there. Upon entering, they were greeted by the center's coordinator, who led them to where Diego was. Diego was a man of about 35 with a closed expression, sitting at a table in the corner of the room. He was reading an old newspaper and barely looked up when Antonia and Eduardo approached. "Diego, good to see you," Antonia said, trying to break the ice. "This is Eduardo. He's just started working with us, and he'll be accompanying you over the next few days." Diego glanced briefly at Eduardo, but his posture remained guarded. He didn't say anything immediately, and Eduardo realized he'd need to be careful. "Hi, Diego. Nice to meet you," Eduardo said, extending his hand in a friendly manner. Diego stared at the outstretched hand for a few seconds before finally shaking it quickly, without much enthusiasm. "Nice to meet you," he said, briefly returning his gaze to the newspaper. Antonia watched the interaction in silence, letting Eduardo handle the situation in his own way. Eduardo knew that pushing a conversation or trying to get close too quickly wouldn't work. He needed to earn Diego's trust slowly. "I know you must be used to people coming here offering help," Eduardo began, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "I just want to understand how we can do this in a way that works best for you." Diego glanced at him sideways, as if weighing his words. "You won't understand what I've been through just by looking at me," Diego said with a slightly challenging tone. Eduardo nodded, accepting the response. "You're right. I can't understand just by looking, but I can listen if you want to talk." Diego shrugged, but Eduardo noticed a small trace of curiosity in his posture. There was something about this man that kept him from fully opening up, but Eduardo sensed that with time, he could build a bridge. The first interaction wasn't a huge breakthrough, but Eduardo knew it would be a slow process. As he left the community center later that day, he felt more aware of the challenges he would face moving forward. There was a lot of work to be done, but he was determined to keep going On the way back to the office, Antonia looked at him with a smile. You handled Diego well. He doesn't trust anyone easily, so don't get discouraged. It'll take time, but you've already taken the first step. Eduardo smiled back, feeling a small wave of relief. Thank you, Antonia. I know it'll be a process, but I'm willing to keep moving forward. And that's exactly what we need, she replied. The most important thing is not to give up. Every small victory counts, even if it seems insignificant at first. In the days that followed, Eduardo returned to the community center, always aiming to earn Diego's trust. Each visit was a small step toward getting him to open up, but progress was slow. Diego still kept his emotional distance, which was understandable given what he had been through. But Eduardo didn't give up. On one of those visits, Eduardo arrived at the community center on a sunny morning. The place was bustling with various activities happening all around. He spotted Diego sitting in his usual corner, flipping through an old book. Eduardo approached calmly and sat in the chair next to him, not saying a word immediately. Sometimes silence was a way to show he was there without putting pressure on him. After a few minutes, Diego spoke without taking his eyes off the book. You're persistent, aren't you? Eduardo smiled softly, understanding that this was Diego's way of acknowledging his presence. I'm not here to bother you, Diego. I'm here to listen whenever you're ready to talk. Diego snapped the book shut and set it aside, finally looking directly at Eduardo. Listen, huh? Everyone always says that they want to listen, but nobody ever really does anything. Eduardo leaned forward, sensing that this was an important moment. I understand what you're saying. It must be frustrating to feel like people only make promises and never follow through. But I'm here to try something different. I don't have all the answers, and I can't change what's happened to you, but I can help you change what comes next if you'll let me. Diego remained silent, his eyes fixed on Eduardo, as if he was trying to decide whether to believe him or not. Do you even have any idea what it's like to be on the street? Diego asked suddenly, his voice low but filled with restrained emotion. To have to fight every day just to survive and still have people look at you like you're invisible. Eduardo felt the weight of the question. He knew he couldn't fully understand what it was like to live on the streets, but he could imagine what it meant to lose everything and be treated as if he didn't matter. No, Diego, I don't know what it's like, but I can imagine how hard it must be. And that's why I want to help you find a way out, if you'll let me. Diego slowly shook his head as if battling the urge to open up. He took a deep breath, and Eduardo could see the man was conflicted, wanting to trust, but held back by the scars of the past. Help, huh? Diego repeated with a tone less skeptical than before. Everyone talks about helping, but the truth is, help usually comes with a price, and I've paid too many prices already. Eduardo nodded, recognizing the pain in Diego's words. He knew that gaining the trust of someone who had suffered so much would require patience. I'm not going to promise you anything I can't deliver, Diego, but what I can guarantee is that I'm not here to ask anything of you. I just want you to have a chance to start over, but that will only happen if you believe it's possible. Diego stared at him, his eyes showing a mix of distrust and curiosity. It was a look Eduardo had seen in other people, a look from someone who was tired of being let down but deep down still wanted to believe. After a long silence, Diego sighed. All right, Eduardo, let's see where this goes. he said without much enthusiasm, but with a tone that suggested he was willing to try. For Eduardo, those words were a small but significant step forward. He knew the road ahead would be long, but that moment was the first step toward what he hoped would become a trusting relationship. In the weeks that followed, Eduardo continued visiting the community center regularly, always keeping in touch with Diego. Little by little, Diego began to share parts of his story. He talked about how he had once been an ordinary worker with a family and a stable life until a workplace accident left him temporarily incapacitated. Without resources and with bills piling up, his wife left him and he lost his home. The lack of support, combined with the physical and emotional pain, pushed him onto the streets where he had spent the last 2 years of his life. Eduardo listened carefully to every detail without interrupting. He knew Diego needed that space to vent, to release the weight of years of suffering. As Diego spoke, Eduardo realized the importance of giving voice to these stories, not just hearing them, but truly connecting with them. After one of these conversations, Eduardo felt it was the right time to make a proposal. Diego, I know you've been through a lot, and I'm not here to force anything on you. But the foundation can help you find a new job, something that fits your skills and your current situation. You don't have to decide right now, but I want you to think about it. It's a chance to start over. Diego frowned, clearly hesitant. A job? You think someone's going to hire me? Look at me. Diego gestured to himself, his worn clothes and the lines of hardship on his face. Who's going to want me for a job? Eduardo understood the doubt. Diego's self-esteem had been shattered by years on the streets, but he knew there was a chance to rebuild it. Trust me, Diego. We work with companies that give opportunities to people who want to start over. It's not easy, but it's possible, and I'll be here to support you every step of the way. Diego looked at him silently for a few seconds, as if seriously considering the proposal for the first time. He knew it was a risk to trust again, but he also knew his life on the streets had no future. I'll think about it, he finally said. Although the response was vague, Eduardo knew progress had been made. The following days brought a new phase in Eduardo and Diego's relationship. The barriers that once existed were starting to crumble, and little by little, Diego allowed himself to trust Eduardo. Although the journey was just beginning, Eduardo knew that every small step forward was a victory. On a sunny Wednesday morning, Eduardo arrived at the community center as usual. But this time, he noticed something different about Diego. He was sitting in his usual corner, but with a more upright posture, and there was something in his eyes that indicated a change. Eduardo approached, greeting him with a warm smile. Good morning, Diego. How's everything going? Diego looked at Eduardo, and after a moment of silence, he said something Eduardo wasn't expecting. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Diego began, his voice firmer than usual. About the chance to start over. I still don't know if I'm ready, but I don't think I can keep living the way I am. I need to try something different. Eduardo felt a wave of satisfaction upon hearing those words. He knew Diego had wrestled with his own doubts and fears to reach that conclusion. And that was a huge step for someone who had lost so much. I'm glad you've thought about it, Diego, Eduardo said with calm encouragement. And you don't have to do everything at once. We'll take it one step at a time. What's important is that you're open to trying. Diego nodded. though he was still visibly nervous about the idea of returning to the workforce. He had been out of the system for so long that the mere thought of being in a formal environment again seemed daunting. Eduardo could sense the weight of that anxiety, but he was ready to support Diego through every stage. "I think I could start with something small," Diego said thoughtfully. "I don't know if I can handle a full-time job right now, but if I could work part-time maybe." Eduardo smiled, pleased with Diego's openness. He knew the foundation offered a variety of opportunities and that there were many partner companies willing to take on people in social rehabilitation, even if it was for reduced hours or in less demanding roles. "At first, we can start with that, Diego," Eduardo replied, keeping his tone calm. "I'll talk to Antonia and Samuel, and I'm sure we can find something suitable for you. We'll go at your pace. No rush." Diego seemed relieved by Eduardo's approach. He didn't want to be pressured, and Eduardo knew that patience was key to ensuring Diego didn't withdraw later. That day, Eduardo returned to the Foundation's office to talk to Samuel and Antonia about the options for Diego. They listened carefully as Eduardo explained the situation and suggested a part-time position at one of their partner companies. "That's excellent, Eduardo," Samuel said, smiling approvingly. "We can reach out to one of our partners that works in recycling. They always need help on the production line, and it's a low-stress environment, ideal for someone starting fresh." Antonia, who was also present, agreed. "And the best part is that the company is already familiar with our reintegration programs. They're patient and have worked with other cases like Diego's. It will be a great opportunity for him," she added, pleased with Eduardo's progress. Eduardo felt a wave of gratitude for being surrounded by people who believed in the potential of those marginalized by society. He knew that finding a job was just the first step, but it was one of the most important. Diego needed this opportunity to start rebuilding his self-esteem and feel like he had value again. The next day, Eduardo returned to the community center to meet with Diego and deliver the good news. "Diego, I found something that I think will be perfect for you," Eduardo said, sitting next to him. "It's at a recycling company, part-time, and they're willing to give you all the support you need to feel comfortable." Diego seemed surprised, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. "Recycling, huh?" he muttered as if processing the idea. "I never thought I'd work with that, but it sounds like something I could do." "It's a good start, Diego," Eduardo encouraged. "You'll learn gradually, and more importantly, you'll begin to feel like you're part of something again." Diego thought for a few seconds, then with a deep breath finally agreed. "All right, I'll give it a try." Eduardo felt a wave of satisfaction. Seeing Diego accept this opportunity was confirmation that the work he was doing at the foundation was making a difference. But more than that, it was proof that when people receive the right help and support, they can rewrite their stories, even after going through the darkest times. On Diego's first day of work, Eduardo made sure to accompany him to the recycling company. It was a small gesture, but he knew that being present at the start of something new was important for Diego. When they arrived, they were greeted by the manager, a middle-aged man with a friendly and welcoming expression. "Diego, welcome," the manager said, shaking his hand. "We're happy to have you here. We'll start slowly, and if you need anything, we're here for you." Diego thanked him timidly. still a bit unsure, but Eduardo could see that he was ready to give his best effort. After a brief introduction and explanation of the tasks, Eduardo said goodbye to Diego, leaving him in the manager's hands. As he walked back, Eduardo couldn't help but smile. He knew this wasn't the conclusion of a journey. It was the beginning of something much bigger for Diego. That afternoon, Eduardo returned to the foundation's office and found Antonia and Samuel. "So, how did it go?" Samuel asked, curious about Diego's first day. "He accepted," Eduardo replied with a satisfied smile. "Today was his first day, and I think he's going to do well. It's just the beginning, but it's a big step." Antonia and Samuel exchanged looks of satisfaction. "Excellent work, Eduardo. You've made a difference in Diego's life," Antonia said with a proud sparkle in her eyes. "Keep it up, and soon we'll have many more success stories like this." Eduardo allowed himself to feel the positive weight of Antonia's words. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Helping Diego find a path was just the beginning of his mission. There were many others like Diego waiting for someone to believe in them. The day ended with a sense of fulfillment. Eduardo knew that the work in the neighborhood was far from over. There were many more people who needed help, many more challenges to face, but he was ready for them now. He wasn't alone. The community was with him, and together they could keep changing lives. As Eduardo walked home that evening, he looked up at the starry sky, feeling the gentle night breeze. He thought about everything he had been through to get here, every difficulty and every victory. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. With a satisfied smile on his face, Eduardo knew that no matter what came next, he was prepared. Because in the end, he had discovered that real change begins with small acts of kindness and the willingness to never give up on people. And if you like this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with your friends. Don't miss the next video coming up on the screen. I'm sure you're going to love it.